Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm okay. So may I ask you please to tell us your name and share with us anything that will help us get to know you a little better, please?
Yeah, my name is Tatanya Richardson. And I don't know, I guess I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. I'm going into my senior year at Duke. Um, I don't know what sort of things. There's like what sort of things I guess.
So where did you go to high school? What was your high school year like? What was your any experience about that? Anything you want to describe about your family, things that you like, don't like, anything that kind of gives us a sense of who you are.
Okay. I went to a high school called North Atlanta High School in like the northern side of Atlanta. It was a school of like about 1,800 kids. It was fairly mixed, so we actually had like a pretty good balance of like students who are white and then students who are black and Hispanic and a decent Asian population as well, which was kind of nice. Um, but one thing about our school that kind of was like an underlying issue was that the more advanced the classes became, or the more advanced classes you took, and this is not a phenomenon that was unique to our school, but the less students of color you would see in a classroom. And I myself often was in like the most rigorous classes kind of like I could take for like whatever my year or semester was. And so like it wouldn't necessarily be uncommon for me to be like one of the few black students, especially like black females in a class,
Mhm.
unless it was say like an arts or orchestra class or something like that. And then perhaps, you'd see more students of color and things of that nature. Um, and so I don't know, it was kind of a normal thing because it was just kind of like the way our school worked. And so I didn't necessarily think about it as much until kind of like after the fact or like after I graduated. Um, but I think a good balancing force to that kind of would have been like my family or my home life. Because my mom did like a fairly good job of kind of like balancing out the narratives or the expectation that like black students or black women weren't necessarily like as capable as like our white counterparts. That was kind of like that theory or like that excuse was not something that would fly in our household ever. My mom was kind of one of those parents who was like, we don't do what everybody else does, so I don't really care. Like if you are capable, then you're gonna do it, and like you're gonna do it well. And so it was definitely a tiring mentality as a high schooler when I wanted to be a lazy hobo, but I think in the long run definitely gave me a solid like work ethic as far as um like classes and like having like a pretty like large faith in myself to like get things done went. And so I think now I definitely thank my mom for it, even though in high school there was a lot of eye rolling and deep sighs attached to it. Um, it's also interesting because I'm the oldest of all my siblings, so there's also kind of that whole like you're going first and you're like doing all of the things, which is nice because like I get to set the example, but it's also like you have to set a good one. So that is also something that was added pressure. But I think overall it kind of it balanced out. It worked out pretty okay. I'd say I've made it this far, and we're doing pretty okay, I think.
Very, very good to hear. So going back to your high school, why do you think it was the more rigorous the class were, the lesser of people of color participated in those classes?
I think some of that has to do with like a societal understanding of like what black students are capable of or what's expected of them. And I also think it has to do a lot with the way that like they put us on a track. So for example, like in our school district, the way it works is you entered gifted or you were able to test for gifted when you were, I want to say in like somewhere in like first or second grade in elementary school. And so for the longest it was just gifted for ELA, but toward the end of my elementary school years they also added it for math. And so if you were in gifted in elementary school, then what that meant was it set you up in middle school to be in the higher level or more rigorous classes for math in ELA. And based on that, by the time you got to high school, then you were either slated to take an honors class or depending on your grade level, you could also take an AP class. And so um, like that by that it was kind of like what was already expected of you, and a lot of kids in elementary school, the students of color, they either didn't get tested for gifted or like they were told they weren't eligible, and so like that track kind of just like set them up, and unless parents or guardians or say a teacher who was really interested in you like fought for you to be in gifted, like it wouldn't happen. It's like I switched into that school district a little bit later, and they almost didn't test me for gifted, but I had come from gifted in our other school district, and so my mom made sure that I still ended up in gifted so that like I would be fine, because she knows, she works in the education system, and she knew like what it would look like if I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
I also think something that played a role in that has to do um, kind of with like some of the narratives or expectations of the way certain teachers led their classrooms, or like the amount of work that they would give. Um, it kind of would scare some students or make it sound like you couldn't do it. And again, like if you didn't have like a base or a background where like someone was telling you, like even if you're nervous, like you had the capability, or like even if it seems kind of hard, like we'll help you figure it out. Like if you don't have that, then like it's not something you might be like gung-ho to like sign yourself up for. um and then parent involvement as well. Like if your parents are not like checking like, oh, what classes are you in, like are you sure these are the ones you want, like it's kind of like it's a conglomeration of kind of like the school system putting you where they want you to be, and like you kind of going with that, and then someone checking to make sure like that's where you should or need to be. And like between those two things, I think of course it kind of like leaves students of color out, or like leaves them behind in one way or another.
Perfect. Absolutely does. My son was academically gifted from first grade, and it's something you have to pay attention to all the time, because they're always looking for ways to slot you in or slot you out,
Yeah.
whichever they can.
Yes, for
So,
sure.
for the school that you go to now for your undergraduate degree, do you find any of that exists there as well?
um I think to some extent, yes, but it manifests itself a little bit differently, I think,
Mhm.
because students have more options in a way. So kind of like it manifests itself, I think, depending on what you study, or like what your major is. And of course, so I go to Duke University, and so of course it is a PWI, which means naturally there are more white students than there are students of color, especially Black students. So that automatically will mean that like in any given classroom, like there might not be as many Black students to begin with, but it also means that like there are kind of like particular narratives or understanding of students of color and Black students particularly coming in. So for example, like in the STEM fields, I came into college pre-med, and so in the STEM fields there is kind of like a push to get more students of color into those fields. But there's sometimes also a understanding, or you could even argue like an assumption, that those students of color coming in will have weaker math and science bases than their white counterparts,
Mhm.
which sometimes is true, but sometimes is also like incorrect. Sometimes the Black students or students of color have even more preparation and preparedness than their white counterparts. It of course depends on the student and where they're coming from, their background. But I would say that like there is a skew toward a lot of Black and brown students like struggling a little bit more in some of those STEM classes, because the support is different, or the way like they're being taught is different, or what they expected is kind of not like what they're coming from high school. um, and I think that also kind of like changes the ways that some of the professors will interact with their Black and brown students, or the some of the like underlying tones of like the notions of like who can do things, or like what students are set up for success, and kind of like how they interact.
Mhm.
um and most of it of course will not be like overt or like in your face, but sometimes it's just a feeling of like they're expecting you to fail,
Right.
or like they're trying to break you. And I think it's really hard, and it can be more difficult like when like these points are made to administration, and it's not necessarily like met with a like a deep willingness to like need it to change, or like a advocacy for those students.
Right.
But by that same token, there are also a lot of departments that are very like welcoming, regardless of students' like color or background or whatever, and they attempt to make it as like welcoming, and I don't want to say colorblind because like that's a really icky term, but actually like equitable, and like give you like a even playing field. Um, but I will also say like one gripe that a lot of Black students have here is actually the Black Studies department, um, because particularly if you study or focus on like the African continent, a lot of those professors themselves are white Americans or white Europeans, and so that's always something that is very weird or very like uncomfortable for like Black students who are majoring in those classes or majoring in that field or like studying in those classes,
Mhm.
because it's really weird to like hear history of like your people or like people who may have been like ancestors in your lineage along some way from a person who you know has very little connection, um, except for like maybe a colonial legacy. And so I think that's something that's also kind of like a weird dynamic that students of color kind of have been trying to like figure out or kind of like navigate for the longest time and are still kind of like working through.
That makes perfectly good sense. So you mentioned that you came in pre-med. Is it your intention to become a doctor?
No, I am no longer pre-med at all, actually. I came in pre-med because for the longest time, probably since like I could string a full sentence together whenever anybody asked me what I wanted to be, the answer was always a doctor.
Mhm.
And I think that that kind of had a lot to do with the narrative of like, especially if you're a Black or brown child, like you become a doctor or a lawyer or like you go into business and like you work your way up the corporate ladder just because like the idea is to have more than your parents had, and like those are like some like three of the basic fields that will give you that. But coming in to university, I realized that like a lot of the things that made me happy and a lot of the places where I found the most joy or like did the best in classes was in my humanities classes, specifically religion and the African studies department. Like I had so much fun, always loved the classes and the professors, and like actually found joy in having to write 10-page papers in like a 2-week span and didn't want to like rip my hair out. um, Whereas like sitting in organic chemistry and biology, I wanted to and did cry several times. um, and of course, like I said earlier, like some of that has to do with the way that professors may or may not be welcoming, but I think a good bit of it also had to do with the fact that like it just wasn't actually what I wanted to do or where I wanted to be. And so the more difficult it got, the easier it was for me to be like, this is not the space that I should be in. And so I'm no longer pre-med, but I don't think I regret the experience because it definitely like taught me a lot. And I'm a student advisor, so like I advise other students on schedules and things of that nature. And so it definitely also helps me to kind of tell them like, you know, this is where you want to be, like you can definitely do it. But if it's not where you want to be, then like that's okay too. Like change happens and like you're gonna be fine. So, you know, tears not my favorite, but definitely kind of worthwhile in the long run.
Absolutely wonderful. There, it gives you the right to change your mind, right?
For sure.
So, as you see yourself, do you have a study group or people that you work with, to help you understand what's been taught, or to help them understand what's been taught, or to kind of create your own community? Have you been able to do that?
Yeah, I've definitely created community in lots of ways. Since I became a religion major and African American studies major, study groups are a little bit less necessary because I don't have as many like written tests. I do a lot more like papers or oral exams and stuff kind of like that. Study groups were definitely a must and a need when I was still taking a lot of the science and math classes. Um, and another thing I think that was really helpful for me was I'm something that's called a Cardea Fellow, which is kind of like a cohort of students who identify as like pre-med. And so it gave us an extra set of advisors and help getting like books and set us up with like study times, like when we had a test coming up, which was definitely really helpful because it made it easier to kind of like block out that time and know that like you would have a consistent group of people who were not only in the same class as you, but probably like somewhere on the same like level of either like confused about what was happening or like understanding what was happening or like whatever the case may be. You were kind of like all together in like your panic and struggle, which was really nice. And even not being pre-med, I'm still friends with a lot of those people because like our first 2 years of college, we were all like shoved into the library like right before test, like staring at whiteboards going, what is happening and why are we here? um, but like outside of like academic study groups, I've also found a lot of community in like faith groups, and even like Black affinity groups have been like a really big thing for me. My sorority particularly, but also just like the Black community at large has been, I think, a really nice home for me, and was definitely something very different coming from high school where like, you know, I was one of the only Black kids in a room. It was nice to like be able to find spaces where it's like, oh, like all of the people in this room are Black. Like that is like a really like nice experience to kind of have in a good way, I think, for me at least, to kind of like find my people.
Very good. So let me ask you this question. Tell me what you think the importance of diverse faculty having community in a predominantly white space means for the success of Black and Brown students.
Diverse faculty and like them wanting to reach out or like build community, or even just students wanting to build community, I think makes all of the difference. Because like, you know, people say it all the time, but it's actually true. Like when you see somebody who looks like you doing whatever it is that you want to do, or even something like adjacent to where you think you're headed, it not only like subconsciously signals in your brain like, oh, like I can do this, but it's also another person who has had to deal with, you know, whatever racist or sexist or all of these other isms and legacies that like exist in our country, and specifically like in higher education. Like
Mhm.
that's another person who's had to deal with that, and not only do they show you it can be overcome, but like they also more often than not are willing to kind of like mentor you through it and be like, you know, as you're going through college and then grad school and whatever else, like this is what you're gonna find, and like this is how I navigated it, and perhaps like you can do the same, or like you can kind of bend it to whatever way you need. But it's someone to talk to like as you're figuring everything out, um, which makes all the difference, especially if you're a student who is first gen or low income, and like the household you come from, like people may not be able to walk you through this, and walking through it by yourself like is only going to get you so far. um, and not only that, like with diverse faculty comes a curriculum that is actually like built for all students and doesn't kind of create like a specific like normativity of curriculum, meaning that like not only one group is centered, but like you'll actually have a diversity of like classes or like discussions in a classroom, which, you know, for higher education should be the goal and should be what's prioritized, because you're trying to make better doctors, lawyers, academics, businessmen, businesswomen, like all of those things. And the more that diversity is normalized, the more productive those spaces can be, and of course the more welcoming they will be. And I think the same goes like for the way that like student communities are built. The more diverse they are, the more narratives or the more backgrounds are in a room when students are talking or like building those communities, and the more like understanding and kind of like um I guess kind of like breaking down of stereotypes or like improper notions you can have.
Mhm.
And so I think like it makes all the difference, not only for students of color to kind of like see themselves in spaces, but also kind of like for the academy as a whole, it can change the way that it's able to function.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. So let me ask you this. This question is about first gens and people whose families have not gone to college or do not have a lot of experience with the higher education platform. What do you think the impact of wealth is on that? So why is it that we just people of color, black and brown, some women have not gone to college because we've been more afraid or reluctant because something may go wrong, or is it an economic issue?
Um, I think it's a conglomeration of factors. Like it's a lot of different things. And I think of course like you can't ignore like the ways that certain systemic factors play into that, of course. So, you know, things like generational poverty or systemic racism, or, you know, even like what age your parents had you at, like stuff like that kind of all factors in. And so I don't, you of course have to call it on a family by person basis, but I think that like you can't negate the larger factors that kind of play a role in it, such as those things. But I also think, I don't think it's reluctance, because like I think what you'll find is like a lot of families, like they themselves either wanted to go to school or like they want their children to be in school. And so I think a lot of it has less to do with reluctance and more to do with like actual like physical capability. So like some of that might be economic or geographic, like might have to do with like immigration status or like all of these other things. Like there's so many factors that play a role in it. um and also some of that might even just come from the idea of like, again, like support and being told like you can go, or like this is something that is like within your realm of like capability and possibility. Like if that didn't happen, or like no one told you, then like you don't know, and you plan your life according to like X, Y, and Z. And so I think it really just depends, but it is definitely kind of like there are some things that kind of perpetuate cycles, and so I think they make it harder to break. But I think it's more than one thing, I think, to name it.
And in a lot of cases, sometimes the reason why students don't attempt the college track is somewhere along the line in their elementary education, someone told them they couldn't, they shouldn't, or they wouldn't amount to much. And then, undoing the damage that does to your mind is kind of hard to do. And then you get yourself to a point where you believe you can do it, and you get into the school, and the majority of your instructors are white. They have different experiences. So when you are in breakdown because you just didn't understand what was said in class, or you didn't get it,
Yeah.
more less likely to ask for that additional help, so, and then where do you turn, which is why I asked you about community and why community was important. So might as well go ahead and talk about this. Did you see the video of Mr. Floyd?
I chose not to watch it. I understand, like, there's so much conversation around like whether or not videos like that should be posted or shouldn't be posted, and like how much trauma they cause. And for me personally, like I knew that would be like a level of like discomfort or just like shock that kind of like I wouldn't have been able to handle. And so I didn't watch it, and honestly, like I don't think I needed to watch it. Like knowing that, somebody sat there with their knee on his neck for, what was it, like 8 minutes and 45 seconds or whatever ridiculous amount of time it was. Like I didn't need to watch it to know like it's unacceptable and horrible and like all of those other things. But I also understand like why some people argue that like it's something that you should watch, or like it's something that did need to be kind of like put out into the public realm.
So if you knew, not watching it, you knew enough to know what had happened.
Mm-hmm.
And how did that make you feel? What were your thoughts about what you knew?
I think it kind of is like especially in like that particular case, um it's one of those things where it hurt and it was heartbreaking and it's upsetting, and like there's all of these stories swirling around about it, but I think that like one of the words that like never crosses my mind is like shocking. Like it wasn't something that felt unexpected. It was more of like, oh, like here we go again, like we're gonna do this whole like drawn out procession again. And I think of course a lot of that has to do again with the ideas of racist legacies in our country, but I think it also has to do with a lot that like in the past 10 or 12 years or so, like there's a perpetual narrative of like the unjust harming and murder of like Black and brown bodies. And there's of course like the list of names that people kind of just like inherently know. And so like it was kind of just another, and I don't mean this to kind of demean it, but it was another name to add to the list, in the sense that like nobody saw it coming, but nobody was like, oh my gosh, like I can't believe this happened. And especially I think like as a Black person, as kind of like within the Black community, it was like, oh, we've seen this before, we know it's going to happen. It wasn't like it is what it is, but it was kind of like a get ready, get prepared, like here comes another fight.
Right. Yeah. And I think that I've heard a lot of people say, young people say that, but I'm 61. I'll be 62 this November, and I can take you back to a time where that was an everyday occurrence, and they weren't just killing one person at a time; they were killing massive amounts of people, And so it is extremely painful. I watched it, and I think the thing that resonated with me most was the fact that the officer had his knee on that man's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds with his hands in his pocket. I mean, like how? I mean, I don't even know what to say to that. I mean, like, it's almost as if this was just routine, a part of the job, right? So I'm supposed to put my hand in it, sort of like you're waiting in line, to get your food and pull out your wallet or something, just routine, right? And that's not the case. So with all of that, where do you, well, let me ask this question first. So why do you think it was so shocking to white people for that to happen? Why do you think it brought the response from white people that it did?
Um, okay. Again, like in the nicest and like least offensive way possible, everything is shocking to white people. Um, like if it is not something that, and of course this is like a sweeping generalization, and you can take it as you will, but if it is not something that is kind of an experience that they themselves have had, or something that like specifically relates to like the social construction of whiteness and like ideologies that surround it, it is like very hard for them to grasp a concept. And when very uncomfortable or hard things or traumatic things happen, the white community, especially white Americans, they don't know what to do with themselves, because generally speaking, they have kind of the ability or the privilege to like ignore the systemic isms and like traumas that the people of color and specifically Black people don't have in this country. Um, and so kind of when they're put into situations where they can no longer ignore it, um, they get really surprised and kind of confused and very uncomfortable. And then some of them get really apologetic, and some of them are like, you dumb Black people, it's all your fault. And so, it's a cycle. It happens over and over again. Um, and I think that like what had a lot to do with the shock this time was that more so than usual, it was a rapid succession of several like cases and incidences of violence against Black bodies. And so then they were really shocked and kind of even more uncomfortable. And I think that that kind of just like heightened the amount of like confusion or like apologetic white people that we saw for, you know, 2 weeks, a month, whatever the time frame may be.
Right. You think it's genuine? Do you think they really intend to care and to do something different? I've heard so much talk about reparations, taking these statues down, and all these things. But do you think this is genuine and intentional? And do you think it will have lasting impact?
Um, I think lasting impact is really debatable, because I think lasting impact comes with like law reform and like change in laws, and that I think is something that will be really hard to accomplish under the current administration, and with a lot of like the current understandings of political lawmakers and like their own personal leanings and identities and those sorts of things. But as far as like genuineness goes for, like a regular, like everyday white person, I think that some of them are genuine and some of them are attempting to be genuine or think that they're being genuine, but run the risk of, or sometimes like become more performative of genuineness as opposed to actually like embodying it. Um, and that's not to say that like all white people have that problem, but I do think that it is something that some of them kind of like fall into. And I think the distinction between the two of like actual genuineness and performative genuineness has a lot to do with how well someone is able to fully grasp like what the issue at hand is. Um, and so like people who see it as like certain incidences or like something that's only happened like in the past couple of years, I think aren't quite able to like fully understand like the trauma or like become like allies that are actually like fully embodying that genuine like care and concern and like trying to fight. Whereas like people who understand that like this is a legacy that's like existed since like the inception of like colonialism and slavery and like all of those things, or who have the general understanding of like the systemic issues and like what all of that means and how all of that plays into this, I think that those individuals are more able to like actually be genuine and like understand the fight and find their place within it. because they have a better idea of like what the actual issue is, and they understand that like the killing and violence against Black and brown bodies is not a cause, but rather like it's an effect of something that is larger.
So why do you think that there is a subset of white America that says all lives matter or blue lives matter and take offense at Black lives matter? And if you have an answer to that, what's the best response to help them understand why we're saying Black lives matter?
So I think like the all lives matter issue, so first of all, as a Black person, I think it's just like one of those things where like you look at people and you're like, I don't understand like how you don't understand this. But once you get past like that shock and confusion and just like wanting to like tilt your head and look at them like, why are you like this? You're kind of able to understand again that it comes from this inability to take themselves out of their own context, or like to understand that there are experiences outside of their own. Because, you know, as far as this country's history and legacy and like systems have taught them, like everything is all well and good, like we've gotten past all of the issues, like racism is not a thing anymore, you know, everybody is like all happy-go-lucky. And as far as they're able to conceptualize or like build around themselves, the entire idea of Black Lives Matter is just like angry Black people like looking for a fight, trying to like blow things up and like burn cities to the ground. um and I think some of that also can be attributed to the way things are taught. So, like, we've kind of talked about like school systems and the way schools set things up before this, and like some of that also has to do with like the curriculum itself. And like within this country, like even outside of school systems, a lot of things are not even a lot of things. Almost everything is white centered in a way that like creates a white normativity that would argue that in fact like all lives matter is kind of the rhetoric that this country believes in. And that is to say that like it likes to wash away the issues of the need to say things like Black Lives Matter, or like the understanding that Native Americans are facing like attacks on their native lands and like their homelands, or like the idea that Latinx people kind of existed in certain parts of this country before white people did, and that like Texas and Arizona were not originally part of the United States, like things of that nature. Right, like things of that nature are not kind of taught in a way that would make it seem like there's still issues right now. So to say all lives matter is, of course, absurd because the actions say otherwise, but the narrative of this country wants you to believe that like all lives matter is the correct way to frame it. Um, and I think kind of I I don't know if there was one singular or like one best response to kind of like try and get somebody to deconstruct that idea or to understand that it's wrong, because I think it depends on like the individual or the community that you're dealing with, because they will all say that all lives matter, but it's constructed different ways in different places to mean different things. And so I think kind of like to respond to it, you have to deal with whatever particular community you're kind of like up against or facing. And sometimes, you know, it also takes not just like a conversation, but an experience that kind of like brings them out of their whiteness or shows them or like is able to put it in perspective, like in relation to themselves, for someone or for particularly a white person to be like, oh, I see like where this is inherently wrong, or like why this phrase doesn't actually work. Um, so I think that's also part of the reason like why it still has been an issue, because there's really no blanket way to kind of be like, this is wrong, and like drive it home for everybody.
And when you think about our society as a whole, as you said earlier, everything is pretty much white, male dominated, you know, wealth, everything is all tied to that. And I always ask, you know, which seems like a reasonable question to me, maybe not to you, but why would someone with power wish to share it with someone else? So if I have all the cookies, why would I want to give you one? Because you never know when I might need to eat a cookie. So why would I give you one?
I think that has to do with an understanding of like how people conceive power, like what power means to them, and also kind of like what their intentions are with that power. You know, some people who have power, their aim is to kind of help the powerless or to kind of create more equity. Where some people, you know, they attain power and their goal, you know, is to keep all of the cookies or all of the money or like whatever it may be. Um, and so I think it has to do kind of with like your understanding of what your role as like a citizen in the society is, or kind of like what your social responsibility to other people is like meant to be.
That's a very good answer. So in the last 5 minutes we have for me to talk, and then I'll give you 5 minutes to end, but in the last 5 minutes that we have to talk, so what changes do you see are necessary for us to rewrite this narrative? What changes are necessary for the young people to do to ensure that their children and their great-grandchildren will not have endured what your parents, my parents, I have endured? What is necessary to change this?
So, like I said before, definitely like law reform is something that has to happen, because those laws consistently create scenarios where like all of the things we see like repetitiously like are capable of happening and kind of are like the equation sets them up to happen over and over again. Like it is inevitable. So I think that that's one. People talk a lot about how the education system needs to change, and I think that that is definitely true. From the narratives that we tell children when they're little to the ways we support them through, like, you know, early school all the way up through high school and into academia. But even more than that, what is taught in the classrooms needs to be like, honestly, like we could throw everything out and start over and would probably be like in a pretty okay place as far as like the way that history and literature and humanities and social sciences like are taught, because as they're set up now, they're very whitewashed, two-dimensional, like cut and dry, like this is what happened, this is what fixed it, everything is fine. Life is a lot more complicated and messy than that. And so I think changing the way that we understand what has happened, what is happening, and what might happen, and how those are all interconnected, definitely would change the way that like people understand their surroundings and are kind of able to like conceptualize social situations or like understand like what it means to exist in a particular type of body within this country. And as far as like what I think like my generation would have to do in order to kind of ensure that like our children didn't go through the same things that like we've seen and our parents have seen and, you know, your generation and so on and so forth, um, is kind of like continue this idea of dismantling notions of normativity, and also, you know, continuing to like raise voices and advocate and fight and, you know, creating diverse populations in as many spaces, all of them preferably, as possible. And kind of just like shifting the idea of like what it means or what it looks like for something to be normal.
So this is my last question. 3 words: Black, persons of color, African Americans. Is there a correlation between those words? And why is one more, like for the longest time we were African Americans, now we're going to people or persons of color. And then, you know, at some point we were Black. And somehow or another we've eloped over here to this part where we have all these different kinds of names that describe us. What's the right answer?
Um, so I mean, I think partially the right answer is whatever the person who you are speaking to likes to be identified as. Like you kind of have to start there, because at the end of the day, it's a matter of like respect and recognition. And I don't want to say giving, because you can't give somebody their humanity, but kind of like understanding and acceptance that like this is the way you identify like in your human person. um but I guess on a larger, like more general scale, um I think the way to understand it is to say that like persons of color is like a broader umbrella, and like you can apply it to Black people, but it doesn't just apply to them, or African American people as well. because I think that those two terms are definitely different, African American and Black, that is. And so persons of color covers not only both of those things, but also things like the Latinx community or the Native American community or the Asian community. It embodies all of those because I think all of those various communities of color do experience different forms of discrimination and racism here in America, not necessarily in the same ways or to the same levels, but there is some ability to relate and understand across them, because they all are in whatever varying levels like marginalized identities. And then like getting more specific to understand African American and Black, I think that that has to do, partially with like an idea of respectability politics, because like for the longest time, like you said African American because like it was like more polite, or like it was what was it was nicer, or like however you want to say that. But then there also kind of became some like dissonance and distaste for the use of that term, when people began to realize like that there's a difference between being an actual African American, meaning that like you can trace African roots, you know, maybe like you're a first or second generation immigrant from an African nation, versus like uh, people who we now call Black, who are Americans that at some point did have a legacy tied to the African continent, but through slavery and colonialism and all of the wonderful things that came with that, can no longer, you know, specifically say like this is my ancestor or ancestors who came from that continent. And so to call them African American kind of becomes very iffy, because it is hard to kind of like differentiate between those who actually are, you know, closely tied to the continent and those who have a looser legacy as a result of history, unfortunately. And so I think that kind of also became something that's been like more talked about, and like a differentiation in those terms, especially with like a growing population of actual African American immigrants in the country. It became more of like a need to, you know, differentiate the understandings, or maybe not even a need, but, you know, social constructs, it became more of a need within that context to kind of be able to separate out the two. And also had a lot to do with like what you wanted to claim, and like, you know, claiming that you are Black had the understanding that like your legacy for the most part resides in this country for better or worse. And that's something to, even for all of its like pain and trauma, to take pride in.
Yeah. And so do you identify as Black or
Yes, I would call myself Black. I, you know, will only say like African American if I am like filling out like one of those little boxes on like a form or something like that. But other than that, like I say Black if I have to write a paper for class, or like on an application, like I write Black, I capitalize it every time, like all of that good stuff.
Yeah, I am Black too. You know, I think that the way the media portrays the word African American, I guess they're still holding on to whatever that past was, you know, but to me, I am Black. I know I am descendants of enslaved people. I know that my people came from somewhere, but I am Black. And it's just simply that I am Black, and I'm not anything else. No matter how many other words you want to wrap around me, I am Black. And I am vulnerable as a Black person. And that needs to be clear, because if you can put African American, you take away the vulnerability, right? Because you're an American, right?
Right.
But you don't get the American dream. You know, I think one of the other things I find really fascinating is the code words that exist, right? So the American people, are they talking about us? No. No, all of these things that you could say, the all-American boy, the all-American girl, they're not talking about us. So when you attach American to African, it's something that makes the majority comfortable, because in literally we are descendants of people who came from Africa, were enslaved to this country, helped make this country what it is. But at the end of the day, the one drop rule still carries. You are Black.
Most definitely.
Not anything else. Okay, all the rest is yours. Anything else you want to close with?
First of all, thanks for having this conversation with me. I like actually really enjoyed it. And I think just like in closing, kind of like what you just said, gets back to the idea of like all lives matter versus like Black lives matter, and understanding that like as long as this country has existed, and particularly when it began to write laws and create like actual real like regulations and things of that nature, it not only didn't, you know, speak to Black people, but it intentionally like excluded them. And there has not been a large scale or like consistent or historical like overhaul of any of those things. And so, you know, of course the Constitution has been amended and like laws have been changed here and there, but like at the end of the day, when the founding fathers of this nation wrote like we the people and like all men are created equal, like Black people, slaves were not men, they weren't people
Right.
in the eyes of those writers.
Right.
And with that understanding, like this nation has a legacy of not recognizing the humanity of Black bodies. And based on that legacy, like going forward from there, like Black lives haven't historically mattered, nor do they in present day. As far as most of laws and regulations are concerned, they still don't necessarily matter. um and so I think like that's something that definitely has to be like thought about, and people should kind of like take note of when they begin to like try and have conversations like this.
I think that's absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much, and I can't wait to see what you do when you start flying. And I know you're already gearing up to fly, so I can't wait to hear what you do. And please stay in touch. And if I can help you in any way, please let me know.
Most definitely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Stay well and stay safe.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.
Bye.